Hi, this is Paul. One of the really interesting things about the internet is that people will tell you what they think. Now, that might be a mixed blessing in many cases, but as a pastor, I often work with people. And in working with people, it's sort of important to try to develop at least some kind of mental map as to how they see the world. And that's remarkably difficult. And it's often difficult in churches because, as I've mentioned many times, you sort of gain or lose status within a religious community according to how your beliefs align with that religious community. Now, part of what happens, though, is that people's the ideas that people sincerely hold, I'll use that word, might differ, and so they'll basically keep them under wraps. I'd really love to do more thinking about the diversity of religious belief with respect to cultural evolution and development, especially with respect to media. But for now, we're in a moment where there's tremendous diversity of opinion among people. This gets into one of the things that I've been pondering about in terms of platforms of belief, of formation, and of pathway conception, let's say. So one person, so people have religious mappings they often can't articulate. And that's, being able to articulate a belief or a thought is separate from having one and living it out. And again, human beings are enormously mysterious on these counts. And so it's really fun to come across someone who can articulate what they believe, because chances are they are speaking for lots of people who are sort of, let's use the language of, shaped by a particular spirit. And so these people are manifesting a particular spiritual reality out there in the world. And so it's fun to find someone who can articulate what they think. Now, for a while, I've followed a person on Twitter who I've a number of times I've sort of tried to approach them, I suppose her pronouns are important to her, so tried to approach her for a little bit of engagement, but usually it doesn't go well. She seems quite fragile. But she recently I was looking for an example of something, and so I went to her Twitter stream, and it was a tweet that I had read a little while ago, and I started looking for it, but I came across an Easter thread of tweets that I thought just remarkably illuminated and exposed and expressed what I suspect are fairly common ideas out there in the world. Now, I know a lot of you who listen to those of you who listen to my channel who are small Orthodox Christians get reactive with this kind of thing and just sort of want to instinctively shout down, no, they're not, or be angry with her, and okay, fair enough. If that's what you're going to do, that's fine. But for me, I always find this kind of thing, well, no, I guess she changed her thing, Pope Joe. I always find these things quite revealing, and I'm quite fascinated by that. And so it's sort of like approaching a rather skittish creature in the wild to say, I'm really curious about how you go about discerning and thinking about these things. But I thought that this Twitter thread on Easter and the resurrection said a lot about certain groups of people. Now, many of her tweets are basically sort of a progressive ex-evangelical deconstruction who doesn't really want to no longer identify as Christian, but has in many ways radically reorganized her Christianity to the point that, let's say, she wouldn't have a very straightforward relationship with the Apostles' Creed. I think the Apostles' Creed remains a part of there are all kinds of issues with propositional profession and belief, But the Apostles' Creed remains a pretty helpful tool to sort of help one navigate and position themselves with respect to historic Christianity. And I could add 1,000 footnotes to that. But I think actually in terms of none of us have enough life to go into all those footnotes. So generally speaking, the Apostles' Creed is a really helpful gauge in order to sort of figure out where people are at with the continuity of obviously the very large and broad tradition that is Christianity. So I'm going to read through some of her tweets here and do a little commentary on them, because I thought, again, she's someone that I think is expressing a spiritual reality, a spirit, a principality, if you will, and articulating it. And again, it's usually helpful to be able to sort of bring these things up to the surface in order to see them. So this is Pope Joe, as she's calling herself, on April 4th. I don't believe Jesus, the man, came back from the dead. I think they argued for that years after he died, because without Jesus' literal resurrection, then Jesus, the historical man, couldn't be the Messiah. The Messiah was supposed to end oppression for his people. Jesus didn't. Now, again, I know some of you might jump all over that tweet, but there's something right about it. Now, her idea that years later the disciples made up this story. There's another video. Oh, let me pause this. This is a video that Marcus, and I talk quite a bit over Twitter with Marcus. He has a small YouTube channel, More Christ, and he actually has quite a number of good conversations and interviews with people. And actually, Jordan Peterson tweeted out this video, Roundtable Jordan Peterson and the Resurrection of Jesus Christ. And it's really quite a good, it's really quite a good conversation. He mentioned how he turned off comments, because with a channel this size, if you don't get a lot of comments, you tend to get a lot of comment spam, and it's sort of a pain to keep knocking it down. And so that's why comments were turned off. But I thought this was quite a good. It had a nice mix of people to have this conversation about Jordan Peterson and the resurrection. Well, why did I bring this up? Oh yeah, well I'm not exactly sure which of the people in this group. I think this is Gerard Casey. I really appreciated. I really appreciate a lot of his comments. I thought they were quite perceptive on a number of scores. But one of the comments that he made was he was reading a piece of work by a Jewish scholar who was commenting on the resurrection. He didn't believe it, but he said, the idea that the disciples sort of cooked this thing up after the fact in order to rescue Jesus' reputation, it just doesn't really hold water. That's sort of the line that Joe picks up here. But at least one of the things that she gets here is the narrative that messiahs are supposed to win, at least. And this is sort of where Jacob and I disagree. I think Jesus radically deconstructs the prevalent and continues to be prevalent idea of what a rescuer is. And so I think Christianity is in fact based on that deconstruction. So, in terms of the first tweet, okay. Now, if Jesus literally resurrected so that he could end oppression. Now what's interesting is this question of oppression, because, and this is common to a lot of things. So oppression are bad things that one group of people does to another group of people. But again, this is all sort of continued to develop in the sort of self-conscious development of this new religion that, well, then you can have internalized oppression within you. And that's not something that can necessarily be easily addressed politically. And this is where you get into all sorts of two-level theories. Another video that I'm thinking about making today. I'm going to make a bunch of shorter videos. We'll see if they actually wind up being short. The idea of consent is really in peril, and consent is sort of the cornerstone of a lot of contemporary sexual ethics. But part of what's happening in our culture is that with all of these two-level theories, as Daniel Bonavec talks about, one of the things they really undermine is the possibility of consent or a stable identity. But that's hopefully the conversation for another video. But again, for Pope Joe's worldview, oppression is sin. That's most of what sin is. And again, this remains a consistent problem with woke religion, is that their theology of sin that gets usually, well, it's racism and sexism and all that. Their theology of sin is really quite shallow and facile. They try to make it a little bit more sophisticated with these two-level philosophies. You can be a racist and not experience animosity towards other racial groups. You can be a sexist and not experience animosity towards sexual groups. You do so by participating in structures, yada, yada, yada. But part of the difficulty of these groups is that, for example, how on earth can you actually live in this world without participating in these structures and systems of oppression? Well, you sort of are allowed to do that by personally feeling really guilty about things, and that feeling really guilty about things sort of becomes the redemption that you need. And actually, Bill Maher in a very interesting little video today, which I thought was quite good. New Rule of the Debbies. Why do so many liberals have this seeming desire to want to be sad? Could it be because being sad feels like you're doing something about a problem without actually having to do anything? Now, there's some deep ties to Protestantism in this, and this is part of the reason why when I began to see woke religion, I thought this is very similar to certain expressions of even my Dutch Calvinism that I've seen throughout history, where because we cannot actually, and again, Pajot's parasitic storytelling, I think, really nails this, because you can't actually get rid of oppression, even though that's sort of your eschatological posture. The way to sort of atone yourself is an internal psychological feeling of guilt and some performative repentance and some ritualized performance in the culture, and that's about as good as you can do. And now, part of why that's as good as you can do is because, unlike, let's say, Apostles' Creed, historic Christianity, where you posit a life of an age to come, punishment, reward, all of these things that are sort of outside the secular box, the secular box really constrains this to be a purely psychological, performative religion. One that, again, a lot of people have their concern about this religion, and I do too, to a degree, but I don't think it lasts. It's just too shallow, and it's going to bottom out. That doesn't mean that a good number of people won't spend their whole lives sort of satisfied by this kiddie pool of a religion, but that's not to say that it won't do tremendous damages, but you don't have to be that well informed in order to find the holes in this thing. And there are many people that are finding the holes in it as we go. And now, again, her ideas about spirituality I found very interesting. Spirituality, not religion or dogma. That's interesting. So then what is spirituality? Well, again, this entire religion is sort of a performative feeling episode. So spirituality is more of a feeling. All right. That's what I would assume. Now, I can't ask her to clarify any of this because she gets really, she's hard to talk to. Anyway, unless she maybe sees this video and will come on the channel. I don't want to, I kind of in a box with respect to some of these things. Okay, spirituality has always intended to serve a much beautiful, always intended to serve, intended by whom I'm not sure, to serve a much beautiful and wider purpose than to ensure a ticket to heaven. And, I understand some of the deconstruction that she's doing here. It's always been about wholeness and harmony to oneself, our communities, and the earth around us. It's about shalom here and now. And I really think, in a lot of ways, Stephen Smith's treatment, putting it in here, pagans and Christians in the city, where he notes that this new paganism is very imminent. It has to be within this frame because again, I don't know if that's fair or not, and I don't have really a chance to ask her because again, in my experience on Twitter, she gets very reactive. There's just not a lot of space for much, and so you're sort of left with a psychological feeling shalom here. And that will likely never come. At least no one in this lifetime will experience it. And that's a rather sad religion where, well, someday, imagine, just think about John Lennon's song, Imagine. Well, John Lennon died. So unless you posit an afterlife where John Lennon can participate in this utopian vision that he has, you just don't get there. And, given the pace of change, I don't think Pope Joe's going to get there either, even though she's younger than I am. And every generation before us never got there. And that then leaves some really deep questions about what exactly is this justice that you're pointing to? I don't see how Jesus, the historical man, coming back from the dead, achieves any of that. This is why. This is a question that I continue to work on in my sermons, because this is the idea that, well, even if he walked out of that tomb, and even if he rode the invisible escalator up into the clouds and is seated on a decorated chair in the Sky Palace, we still have injustice here. What difference does the resurrection make? If anything, history shows us that the effects of atonement theories and physical resurrection narratives to be able to make it to heaven are the opposite of harmony and wholeness. In other words, she's continuing to sort of deconstruct Christianity and say, well, people fight about atonement theories, about who gets to go to heaven, and all of that fighting is the opposite of harmony and wholeness. Now, in other words, all of that fighting over atonement theories is pointless, whereas all of the conflict over justice and, you can sacrifice harmony and wholeness in the pursuit of some hoped for justice at the, in some future perhaps that you yourself will never actually participate in. Well, but is that really going to help you much? Because you are going to fight over these things, and can you actually get there? Now, I do love spiritual resurrections. Oh, okay. Well, what does she mean by that? Spiritual resurrections. I gotta make sure I get all of the tweets, 7 and 8. Okay, there they all are. Good. I do love spiritual resurrection. What do you mean by that? Again, what is spiritual? Well, spiritual is functionally emotional. Spirituality is basically reduced to positive emotion. That's pretty much what it is. Maybe some physical things that will yield positive emotions, but it's sort of a self-transcendent experience or something of that kind. or what some are calling awakenings. And again, those of you who saw, awakening is the Puritan word that they used. And I read that piece in George Marsden's book about Timothy Edwards, Jonathan Edwards' father. I love the invitation of Christ to bring back to life the one we were created to be. Now this is where things start to get sort of mystical, because we have the secret, sacred self. And so there's a true self that she imagines. Now, where does this true self live? It's certainly not lived within the secular frame. So there's no other frame necessarily. Maybe she thinks so, I don't know. There's no other frame necessarily for justice or punishment or reward or anything like some more traditional Christianity has. And then, of course, atonement theories talk about, well, rules or understandings about why one would participate in one and not the other, et cetera, et cetera. But now, maybe there's not a world above or beyond, but there's a world below or beneath. And so it's really hard to fit these narratives within a secular box. To bring back to life the one we were created to be. Okay, and when was this creation? Was this at the moment of your conception physically? No, again, she almost goes into, now it's very interesting because Mormonism has pre-existing souls, and the homeless man that I learned a lot of my Mormonism from always talked about children pick their parents. Children pick their parents. Oh, okay. Even though there were issues. Children pick their parents. So there's supposedly a secret, sacred self that has never been within the box of secularism that Christ brings back to life with this spiritual resurrection. The one drowned under societal expectations, religion, systemic abuse, and the trauma of living in an unhealthy society. So this is very Rousseauian. So Rousseau has his fingers on this. Rousseau, of course, who grew up in Calvinist Geneva. But the idea is that there's a pure self that has never been in the material frame in any way, shape, or form. Now, again, we don't dare imagine anything above or beyond, but within or beneath, somehow there is a space. And so it's very hard. You see sort of materialism creeping up on this, but it's very hard to sort of maintain that. You've almost always got to find some space to house perfection in this world that we've been given. I love the idea of awakening to the awakening to the ways in which our true self has been tortured to fit into a world that says we are not good or enough. Now, again, there's a really interesting inversion here, because the sentence itself basically says that the actual self of the person has now been the victim of this cruel world, but that is also saying that the actual self is not good enough. The true self somehow has to emerge and awaken, but that true self can probably never be actualized because you are sort of stuck within the iron box of secularism. So resurrection as motif here, much more than any kind of resurrection as any participation in any world that will ever be fully actualized. Now, my text this week is Jesus appearing to the disciples and eating a fish, because the point that Jesus makes is that he has a physical body, that there's an actualization of the kingdom of heaven in the resurrected Jesus. But if you push all that away in contemporary skepticism and deconstruction, you lose a bunch of things that now suddenly you have to look for in some other ways. I love resurrection as healing, expanding, knowing our true selves, but never actually actualizing them. Showing up as divinity embodied, but never actually embodying it. But again, divinity, okay, well, what is that? So she just brought a new word in here. And now divinity, well, all goodness, perfection, but again, she's stuck in this imperfect world. And you find these kinds of paradoxes and bondages in this type of religious construction. And again, what you find in, say, small or Orthodox Christianity is that actually many of these things are addressed, but she can't, and this is something that I find in many who are sort of exploring Christianity, she can't quite get there to believe in it. Okay? And she can't, it's more than she can hope for. And so she settles for this very Protestant-ish, small in-the-box thing. Whole, free, aware, conscious, but she'll never get there. She'll never be that. I don't believe the historical Jesus literally came back from the dead. I do know that such an idea has often been useless. And what's most in other words, anything that is problematic needs to be jettisoned, except, of course, if she doesn't see the problems in the idea she has. I do know that such an idea has, and actually that whole business of things being problematic becomes a dogma. And that dogma then governs the ability to believe certain things. I do know that such an idea has often been useless, and what's more concerning, it has been harmful. See, right there it is, it's harm. And, back to Jonathan Haidt. Harm. Well, what is harm? And so this afternoon, some total stranger stuck a needle in my arm. And, my arm's not sore yet. Maybe it'll be a little sore tomorrow. I don't know. But did that person do me harm? See, it's harm is always within a context. Harm is sort of almost an agent that functions within an arena. So getting a COVID vaccination, is that harmful or helpful? Well, that's obviously the debate. If you've got questions about, I'll be the Pfizer zombie, I guess, because I got a Pfizer vaccine. So these are the issues that we're dealing with. I also know that it has stolen from a bigger, deeper, more comprehensive message of being the Christ. In other words, the words of Jesus. Now, I'm a pastor, so I'm pretty familiar with a lot of the words of Jesus, and I can bring a lot of them to mind because I imagine that only some of the words of Jesus she would say, well, those are the true words of Jesus. And then you sort of get back down into, well, these are words that we're not interpreting properly, or he didn't say, or something like that. But so she's got her canon within a canon of certain words of Jesus. And those are the words about oppression and injustice and liberation. And again, you can see that a bigger frame has sort of been pared down into a tiny little narrative of freedom from oppression and harm. So the comprehensive message of being the Christ, of being the Messiah. So again, of Messiah understood as releasing us from oppression. When we heal in order to be able to show up as our true selves. That's really interesting because it's when we heal, in other words, is healing actually for the other, or is the suffering oppressed other an opportunity for our own glorification? When we heal in order to be able to show up as our true selves, the ones we were created to be, again, so God is exactly what exactly we are in terms of our anthropology, that's not clear here. Then we transcend our existence in the way we were meant to. This stuff gets tricky. We leave for our descendants healing, wholeness, and a society that's closer to heaven on earth. So there's a progressivist vision. That's immortality. Okay, so there's a redefinition of immortality. In other words, the thing that doesn't die is the process. So is it a sort of process theology? Very interesting. Again, I want to be careful here because my intention is not to just slam or criticize or anything like that, but you cannot examine something and critique it and evaluate it if you don't know it. And here, at least, she's putting it on Twitter for all to see, and she's, she in a sense, this is her Easter sermon. And that is the only kind of resurrection and immortality I'm interested in. Okay. Resurrecting after religion tried to bury me. Coming to myself, again, this is the secret, sacred self. Where that self is, I don't know. After Christianity tried to destroy me. That's really confusing. Because coming to herself in the previous thing is supposed to be this transcendent, when we transcend our existence in the ways we were meant to, but at the same time trying to destroy me. Now, again, you can take that because Christianity actually has this very strange dying to self and living to Christ. So it could be sort of a legacy code of that being expressed through this. But I'm just fascinated by statements like this because, again, it just gives me a window into how people are constructing their faith and worldview. Happy Easter. May we all come back to life and rise in spite of religion. As if this entire 10-point Twitter sermon, 9-point Twitter sermon, wasn't religion or religious. Again, she means dogma. But of course, you can't state something like this and not actually make dogma. There are dogmas implicit within it. And once you say it, and once you give it force by whatever status you have. Now, let's see. Let's look at status. Oh, 17,000 Twitter followers, followed by Scott Colley and some other people. So very, very interesting. Very, very interesting. And again, to me, when I watch the principalities and powers at war over Twitter, these are the kinds of things that get me interested because, well, this is, I assume, at least to a degree self-consciously, what she believes. So I thought I'd share that. I found it very interesting because I'm trying to understand this emergent religiosity that is around us. And I think a lot of people would read this Twitter thread and say, yeah, it's like that. And actually, because I'm a minister, I want to be able to talk to people who believe this. And I think it's a deficient dogma that it's a deficient religion. And of course, she thinks mine is deficient, so fair enough. And again, I'm not triggered or testy or anything like this. It's just data, just trying to learn. But so found it very interesting. Hope you did too.